When you get a graph or a chart in Task 1, the first thing to do is to check how many years are shown. When there is just 1 year shown on the chart, you organise the categories according to which ones are the highest and which ones are the lowest. If there is more than 1 year on the chart, we organise the categories according to which ones increased and which ones decreased. And that is pretty much it. Overviews are actually that easy. In this lesson, we will look at examples of how to do this, and I will give you extra advice related to any potential problems that might arise. My name is Lara Ryan. I've been an IELTS examiner. I used to be an IELTS teacher at the British Council. I've been teaching IELTS for over a decade, and I am the founder of Complete Test Success. Before we look at the first example, in case you don't already know what an overview is, it's a general description of the graph that does not include any specific details. And if you cannot write one of these, you're not going to get a task achievement score higher than a band 5. To get started, we're going to look at graphs that have more than 1 year, and that means that these are organised according to which ones increase and which ones decrease. When doing this, we're only interested in data for the first and last year. So let's look at England in 1980 and 2020. We see that this is a decrease, so I'll put an arrow pointing downward next to England. Next, we will look at the red line, which represents Scotland. In the overview, we won't mention that it increased in the beginning and decreased for the rest of the period, because the overview is just a general description of what happened. The other information will be described later in the other paragraphs of our answer. So again, for Scotland, by just looking at the first and last year, we would describe this as a decrease, and I will put an arrow pointing downward next to Scotland. For Wales, we would consider this to be an increase, so I put an arrow pointing upwards next to Wales, and the situation is the exact same for Northern Ireland. Now really, drawing these arrows is fundamental to organising your overview because it allows you to look at everything in one go and you can see all the patterns very easily. 2 of them are pointing down, 2 of them are pointing up. Now, drawing arrows like this is very easy if you're doing the paper-based test. You just draw them directly onto the question sheet. However, if you're doing the computer-based test, there is no way to make annotations on the screen, so you'll have to draw a rough sketch on your notepad and then include the arrows from there. But don't worry, this only takes a few seconds. For this question, I would draw something basic like this for each category, and then just add my arrows as normal. There's no need to draw any more detail than this because the chart will still be in front of you on the screen when you need to check the actual figures. So with my arrows drawn, we can easily see that 2 categories increased, 2 categories decreased, and that's what I'm going to put in my overview. And here's the overview I've written for this question. Overall, the amount of cheese being eaten in England and Scotland had decreased by the end of the period, whereas it had increased for Wales and Northern Ireland. And that is all you need to do to write an accurate overview. Let's look at another question with more than 1 year. There's no need for us to draw arrows in the chart for 2010 because what we're looking at is the difference between 2010 and 2020. So looking at LG, we can see it had 20% in 2010 and 10% in 2020, so I'll put an arrow pointing downward next to LG. Samsung decreased as well, so here's another arrow pointing downward. Sony actually had 10% in each year, so I'll put an arrow pointing to the right. This is how I will remember that it stayed the same. And one by one, I'll go through each category like this and put the arrow next to the name. Again, with all these arrows drawn, it's really easy to see how we will organise these in our overview. Overall, the proportions of TCL, Hisense and Vizio increased, whereas the percentages of LG and Samsung decreased, and Sony remained with the same proportion. Note that I haven't mentioned the year in my overview. This is because in our essay, the paraphrase of the question will come before the overview, and that information will already be clear to the reader. For now, let's look at another example. This one is very straightforward. The blue one increased and the red one decreased. So here's my overview. Overall, there was a decrease in the percentage of families who stayed in Bangladesh for their holidays, and an increase in the percentage who travelled to another country. Here's another example with more than 1 year. Just like before, we're only interested in the first and the final year. So for the first category, spinach, there was a decrease. For broccoli, there was an increase. Garlic, increased, peas increased, and ginger also increased. With all the arrows in place, we can easily see that 4 increased and 1 decreased, so again, we'll just write that in the overview. Overall, by the end of the period, there was an increase in the weight of all the vegetables being imported into Qatar, except for spinach. As you can see, we don't actually need to include the names of every single category in our overview. As long as we include a general description of what happened, that's fine. In fact, writing descriptions like this can be very useful when there are a lot of categories in a question. And in some questions, there will be predictions for the future. When this happens, you have to describe the data from the past and the data from the future completely separately. So we'll just describe the data from the past first, and then we will describe the predictions. So here we have 2 years from the past, 1980 and 2020, which means we will organise these categories according to increases and decreases. For TV and movies, the figure was 100 in 1980 and 160 in 2020. So I'll represent this increase with an arrow pointing upwards, and then I go through the rest of the categories in the same way to indicate which ones increased, which ones decreased, and which ones remain stable. And then I do the exact same thing for the predictions. Looking at TV and movies again, I can see that the numbers are 160 and 175, so I'll mark this with an upward pointing arrow and do the exact same thing for all of the other categories. And that leaves us with 1 arrow on the left representing 1980 to 2020 and 1 arrow on the right representing the predictions. Once more, with all the arrows in place, I'm very confident about what I need to include in my overview. Overall, by 2020, the popularity of TV and movies, books and working out had increased, whereas baking, gardening and video games had decreased, and playing music remained stable. The predictions for the future show that TV and movies and books are expected to rise further, while all the other hobbies are projected to have a decrease in popularity. When you're drawing the arrows like this, make sure that they're clear and tidy so that you can scan them all quickly. Here's another question with more than 1 year and predictions. In this question, looking from 1900 to the current year, I can see that the line for Saudi Arabia goes up, the line for Qatar goes up, and the line for Ghana goes up as well. And then I look from this year to the final year, 2040, and I can see that the line continues upward for each of the countries. So with that, let's look at the overview. Overall, the university dropout rates for Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Ghana have increased, and this trend is predicted to continue for all 3 countries. So as you've just seen, we do need to describe the predictions separately, but besides that, they're described in the exact same way. I hope this lesson is helping you, and if it is, you can help me as well by clicking like on the video. All the questions we looked at so far had more than 1 year. Next, we're going to look at questions that have just 1 year in the graph, and that means that we're organising the categories according to which ones were highest and which ones were lowest. As you can see, all the data in this question is for 2020, which means we're looking for the highest and the lowest categories. In this chart, Hungary has the highest figures for rice production and South Korea has the lowest. And for rice consumption, Hungary also has the highest figure and South Korea also has the lowest. Here's our overview. Overall, Hungary had the highest numbers for both rice production and consumption, and South Korea had the lowest. You've probably noticed, however, that this overview is quite short, and I will show you how to expand on short overviews like this later in the lesson. Here's another one, and this one doesn't actually mention any year, and that means that the data is based on the current situation in these countries right now. As it's not more than 1 year, we're looking for highest and lowest again. Under the category called spend, I'll mark the highest percentage with a H and the lowest with an L. And then I'll do the exact same thing for the categories save and invest. And in the overview, we'll describe which countries these figures belong to. Overall, Morocco has the highest percentage of people spending and investing their discretionary income, while Finland has the highest percentage for saving. Pakistan has the lowest percentages for spending and saving, whereas the lowest percentage for investing belongs to the Vietnamese people. And here's another chart with just 1 year. So like before, we will mark the highest figures with a H and all of the lowest figures with L's. And here's the overview. Overall, the United Kingdom has more silver than bronze or gold medals, whereas the other countries have more bronze. However, for all the nations, gold medals were won least often. And we'll look at one more example for this type of question. I have the H's and L's already marked, so here's the overview. Overall, East Timor's most popular film genre was action, whereas the least popular was drama. In Hungary, science fiction had the most box office sales, while comedy and horror accounted for the least. Now, you do need to be careful with what language you use in the overview. Just because we're looking for the highest and the lowest values doesn't mean that we will use the words highest and lowest in our answers. For example, in this question, we needed to use the phrases most popular and least popular. So just like before, we might end up with predictions for questions like this as well. When you first look at this question, you'll see that it has 2 years, 2000 and 2040. So you might initially feel like you need to organise the categories according to increases and decreases. However, you'll remember from earlier that we must separate the data from the past from the predictions for the future. That means that we just have 1 year from the past and must organise this according to the highest and the lowest figures. And after that, it's most logical to do the same thing again with the predictions. And once more, with the annotations made on our question, we're ready for the overview. Overall, watching TV and movies was the most popular hobby in 2000, while playing video games was the least popular. The predictions show that this situation is expected to continue in 2040. Now, another type of question you can get is where there are 2 different charts. Very often this will be one pie chart and one table, and the data in each one is completely separate. Now, because each chart displays completely different data, we cannot make comparisons, and that means that we just need to describe each one separately. Besides that, we organise the categories in the exact same way, according to which ones increased and decreased when there's more than 1 year, or according to highest and lowest when there is just 1 year. Here's one such question, and this one is based on just 1 year, so I'll mark the highest and the lowest on the top graph. You'll see that I needed to use the equal symbol here because the 41 to 50-year-olds have 40% in each category. I do the same thing for the bottom graph, and now we're ready for the overview. Overall, competitive sports were more popular with the 3 youngest age groups, whereas the percentage was roughly equal for the 41 to 50-year-olds, and the over 50s preferred non-competitive sports. Regarding the amount of time spent playing sport, the youngest group spent the most, while the 31 to 40-year-olds spent the least. Now, when you look at the middle age group, you might have some ideas about why they spend less time playing sport. For example, they might be busier with their children or with their jobs, but that information is not on the chart, so you cannot mention anything like that in your answer. And I have one more question for you with multiple charts. This time the chart has data for 2000 and 2010, which tells us we need to organise it according to increases and decreases. So here are all the arrows that I need for the top graph. And in the table, the plus and minus symbols make it pretty obvious which ones increased and decreased already, so we're not going to draw any arrows on this. And here's the overview. Overall, Yemen's exports to Somalia decreased in value, but increased for the other 4 countries. The only drop in export values was for cotton. Earlier in the lesson, I told you we would look at what to do when the overview is too short, and I actually have 2 possible solutions for you. Solution number 1 is to add adverbs and adjectives so that the overview is more descriptive. I've already covered adverbs and adjectives in my vocabulary lesson, so you can check that out. There's a link in the video description. Solution number 2 is to find other key features and include that in the overview as well. And here's a question we already looked at with a short overview. Solution 1 is to add adverbs and adjectives, so I can say, overall, university dropout rates for Saudi Arabia and Ghana increased considerably, while Qatar's rate rose moderately. And this trend is predicted to continue for all 3 countries. You'll notice that I needed to separate Qatar from the other 2. This is because only Saudi Arabia and Ghana increased considerably, and if I wrote that they all increased considerably, this would be inaccurate and that would negatively affect my task achievement score. And solution 2 is to find other key features. In this chart, what's most noticeable is that Qatar decreased here and Ghana decreased here. So I can say, overall, the university dropout rate for Saudi Arabia has increased, and despite some decreases, Qatar and Ghana's rates have also experienced a general growth over the period. Moreover, by 2040, the figures for all 3 countries are predicted to climb further. And we will look at one more example where the overview was a little bit short. Now, solution number 1, where we add adverbs and adjectives, won't actually work with this overview as we can't use them with these superlatives. That means that we must rely on solution number 2. We might want to focus on the fact that Hungary's figures are so much higher than the others, so we can say, overall, Hungary had the highest numbers for both rice production and consumption and was significantly higher than the majority of the other countries, while South Korea had the lowest figures. Or we might decide to focus on the Philippines being the only country that was anywhere near Hungary's figures. Overall, Hungary had the highest numbers for rice production and consumption, and the Philippines was the only country to come relatively close to these figures. In contrast, South Korea had the lowest figures in both categories. Or finally, we could decide to focus on the fact that Bangladesh was the only country where the figures for rice production was lower than the one for rice consumption. Overall, Hungary had the highest numbers for both rice production and consumption, and South Korea had the lowest. Bangladesh was unique on this chart as it was the only country with lower rice production than consumption. If you'd like to see more examples of overviews written like this, you'll find them on my website, and there's a link in the video description as well. Please let me know in the comments if overviews are easier for you now than before you completed this lesson.